There's a small mark on some people's driver's license. Not everyone has it, and most people don't pay much attention to it, but if everyone had this, we could save thousands of lives. This indication is whether or not you're an organ donor. Now, assuming everyone in this room supports organ donation and would be willing to donate their organs, less than 40% of us would actually be registered organ donors. And now, according to some studies, like the one conducted by Sam Sheen of McGill University, you are 5 times more likely to need a transplant than to be an organ donor. This contributes to a massive organ shortage, and we see this in the data. OrganDonor.gov shows that there are 120,000 people currently on the wait list for an organ, but only 15,000 who are signed up to be donors. Now, this shortage is created by the current system we have in place and leads to 2 major problems. But we can solve that problem, and we can do that by switching to an opt-out system of organ donation as opposed to the current opt-in system. I'll also address some of the counter-arguments to this system at the end of my speech. Now let's talk about the current system. Currently, organ donations are governed by the National Organ Transplant Act of 1984, which established the ways in which the government can procure organs and the property rights of the deceased. It also set up the Organ Procurement and Transplant Network, which is responsible for connecting organs to those who are in need of organs and is the governing body for organ donations in the United States. But let's take a step back and talk about how one becomes an organ donor in the first place. These signups take place at the DMV. The first time you likely encountered the option to be an organ donor was when you signed up for your driver's license. There was a box you could check somewhere on that form that asked whether or not you would like to be an organ donor. Now the problem is many people in a rush to get their driver's license skim right over this and don't check that box, or they see this as a decision that they want to come back to later, or they're misinformed about organ donations and simply leave this till later. The problem is people don't come back because going to the DMV is such a hassle, and having to wait to do something that we don't see as important is just something that people don't go and do. Now this leads to a major organ shortage because the majority of people are not organ donors. This leads to 2 distinct problems. The first is the fact that thousands of people die when their deaths could be prevented. Every 10 minutes, a person is added to the organ transplant list. That means by the time I finish this speech, there will be 1 more person who is waiting to hear if they'll be able to get a life-saving organ or not. And this is a real fear for people, because according to the Department of Health and Human Services, 22 people die each day waiting on the organ transplant list. Now there are people from all walks of life on this list, from the very, very young to the very old. ABC News recently did a story about 9 different people who were on the wait list. One of these people was a 9-year-old named Coulter. Now Coulter, like other 9-year-olds, likes Star Wars and playing in the dirt with his friends, but unlike other 9-year-olds, has a pump that he keeps under his shirt that pumps medicine to his heart 24 hours a day to keep it from failing while he waits on that new organ transplant. The problem is this medication also has a risk of kidney failure, so at the young age of 9, there's a potential for Coulter to need not 1 but 2 organs. There's a second problem that this leads to, which is human organ trafficking. According to the WHO, 10% of organ transplant operations that took place in the year 2015 were done so with organs obtained illegally. While this seems like a small number, I want you to think about what that means for an organ to be obtained illegally. This means, at best, someone was coerced into selling their organ, and at worst, somebody was kidnapped and murdered, and somebody else had sold their organs. Now, the United States is considered to be an organ importing nation, which means that oftentimes people from the United States will buy organs from other nations in order for the transplant procedures to occur here. The WHO has recorded that an organ can go from anywhere to $70 to $160,000 on the black market, making this an exceptionally lucrative market for international criminals. So how do we stop this? I propose that the United States move from an opt-in system of organ donation to an opt-out system of organ donation. So how does this work? Going back to the DMV, instead of having to check a box to indicate that you would like to be an organ donor, you would check a box indicating that you would not like to be an organ donor. While this seems like a trivial change, other countries have implemented it and seen magnificently positive results. After Spain implemented this program, after only 10 months, they saw a 150% increase in the number of people who were organ donors. The New York Times reported that 99% of people in Austria are organ donors now that Austria has implemented this opt-out system. This works simply because of simple behavioral economics. What that states is that if somebody is indifferent between two options, in this case, being an organ donor or not being an organ donor, they'll take the path of least resistance, the path that they don't have to do the most work. In this case, that would be not checking the box, which is why so few people are organ donors in the United States. Implementing this system would flip it on its head. If we assume we'll see the same increase as Spain, this means that we will have 140,000 people who are organ donors, which is more than enough to solve the organ shortage. But even if we don't see that increase, every single person that signs up to be an organ donor can save up to 8 lives because of the massive amount of organs you can donate after death, including your kidneys, your heart, various tissues, etc. Now, of course, there are some objections to this. 2 main ones, one being practical and one a bit more philosophical. The more practical objection is that people wouldn't know that they were signed up to be organ donors and thus would have their organs donated without them wanting to. This simply won't happen because people still have the ability to opt out of this system, and a policy change like this would likely create increased awareness about organ donations, meaning that anybody who would not want to be an organ donor would be able to go and opt out. In addition, in situations like this, families do still have jurisdiction over the bodies of the deceased if this was a major issue for them. The second is a more philosophical objection, that we shouldn't have a system which assumes that the government has the right to your bodies after death. Now, this deals with active versus implicit consent. Our current system implies active consent, that we must actively consent for our organs to be donated after death. This system would move us to one of more implicit consent, saying that we implicitly are allowing for our organs to be donated after we die. And the fact that you can still opt out means that nobody is assuming that that they own your organs. It's simply just a shift in what the default setting is for people. Now, this system will not fix itself. We are able to save the lives of thousands of people if we move to this new system. Coulter was lucky, and after about 10 months on the wait list, he was informed that he would receive a heart, and is now awaiting that operation. But for 8,000 Americans every year, they are not so lucky, and they die on that transplant list. This is something so simple that we could do in order to save thousands of lives. It's worked elsewhere, and it'll work here. And I would urge the United States to opt in to an opt-out system of organ donation. Thank you.